I never imagined that Christmas dinner at my childhood home in Cedar Falls would end with my mother declaring, "You're not family anymore, Natalie," in front of 23 relatives gathered around our mahogany dining table. Even less could I have anticipated the look of absolute devastation on Patricia Thornfield's face when I delivered my response. A single sentence that would shatter 31 years of carefully constructed family mythology and expose secrets she'd spent decades burying. But that moment, a crystal clear confrontation that ripped away years of manipulation and favoritism, became the catalyst that not only freed me from toxic family dynamics, but transformed me from the forgotten daughter into the woman who would finally claim her rightful place in the world. Let us know in the comments where you're watching. If this resonated, don't miss out on subscribing because tomorrow I'm sharing something that will completely change how you think about this topic. The Thornfield family Christmas had always been Patricia's masterpiece of orchestrated perfection. Every December 24th, our sprawling colonial house in Cedar Falls became the stage for what she called a celebration of family values and tradition. The dining room would be transformed with her grandmother's crystal, imported Belgian lace tablecloths, and centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. But this particular Christmas Eve felt different from the moment I walked through the front door. The usual warmth that greeted family members was notably absent when I arrived with my homemade cranberry sauce, a recipe I'd perfected over years of bringing contributions that were consistently relegated to the kitchen counter, while store-bought alternatives took center stage on the dinner table. "Natalie," my mother said, her voice carrying that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over 3 decades, the one that sounded pleasant to observers, but carried an undertone of disappointment that only I seemed to hear. "You're late. Again." I checked my phone. 4:47 p.m. Dinner was scheduled for 5, and I lived 45 minutes away in the city where I ran my small but successful graphic design business. I actually made remarkable time considering the holiday traffic, but punctuality had never been about actual time with Patricia Thornfield. It was about establishing hierarchy from the moment of arrival. "Traffic was heavy on Route 15, I replied, hanging my coat in the closet where it would inevitably be buried beneath the expensive cashmere and wool pieces belonging to my siblings and their families. The house buzzed with its usual Christmas chaos, but I noticed immediately how the energy shifted around me. My brother Daniel, the golden child who'd inherited our father's accounting firm, barely looked up from his conversation with Uncle Robert about expansion strategies. My sister Cassandra, whose pharmaceutical sales career had always been praised as so much more stable than artistic pursuits, offered a distracted wave while helping her twin daughters arrange presents under the 12-foot Fraser fir that dominated the living room. What struck me most wasn't what was happening, but what wasn't. In previous years, despite the underlying tensions, there had at least been perfunctory questions about my business, polite inquiries about my life in Millbrook. This year, I might as well have been invisible. The dining room table told its own story. Patricia had outdone herself with the seating arrangement, a carefully orchestrated display of family hierarchy that would have impressed corporate executives strategizing boardroom power dynamics. At the head sat George, whom my mother had married when I was 12, after my father's death had left her a widow with 3 children and a determination to rebuild our social standing. To George's right sat Daniel with his wife Amanda and their teenage son Marcus. To his left, Cassandra with her husband Trevor and their twin daughters. The extended family, George's brothers, their wives, various cousins, filled the remaining seats around the table's perimeter. And at the far end, nearly in the kitchen doorway, sat a single-place setting that might as well have been labeled charity case. "Natalie, you're down there," Patricia directed, gesturing toward the isolated seat as if it were a natural arrangement rather than a deliberate statement about my place in the family hierarchy. I had attended enough corporate events through my design work to recognize power positioning when I saw it. The seat was strategically placed where I could serve as overflow help for kitchen duties, where my conversations would be drowned out by the distance from main table discussion, and where I could be easily overlooked when family photos were taken. But what truly caught my attention wasn't my own marginalization. I'd grown accustomed to that over years of watching my artistic career dismissed as a hobby that got out of hand, while my siblings' more traditional choices were celebrated. What struck me was the empty space. "Mom," I said quietly, Where's Dad's chair? For 31 years, even after George had joined our family, my biological father's antique Windsor chair had maintained its place at family gatherings. Not used, but present. A subtle acknowledgement of the man who had loved Christmas morning pancakes, who had built the treehouse that still stood in our backyard, who died in a car accident when I was 7, but whose memory had always been honored during holiday traditions. Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We've rearranged things for better conversation flow. That old chair was looking shabby anyway.
The old chair that she'd spent hundreds of dollars restoring just 3 years earlier. The chair that had been my father's favorite spot for reading Sunday morning newspapers. The chair that represented the only tangible connection I had to the parent who'd actually understood my artistic nature, who'd encouraged my creativity instead of trying to redirect it toward more practical pursuits. "What did you do with it?" I asked, though something in her evasive expression told me I wouldn't like the answer. "We donated it to charity. It was taking up unnecessary space." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not sold, not stored, donated, given away as if it held no significance, as if the memories attached to it were worthless, as if my father's presence in this house had become an inconvenience to be discarded. "You donated Dad's chair without telling me?" "Natalie, we don't need to discuss this now. It's Christmas Eve." She moved toward the kitchen with the brisk efficiency she used to shut down conversations that threatened to disrupt her carefully maintained family image. But I followed her, my voice slightly raised despite my efforts to remain calm. "That chair was the last piece of furniture he actually chose for this house. You remember, he saved for 3 months to buy it from that antique shop in Burlington because he said it reminded him of his grandfather's chair." "Lower your voice," Patricia commanded, glancing toward the dining room where 21 family members were pretending not to notice our exchange. "You are creating a scene over furniture." Over furniture, as if the systematic removal of my father's presence from our family narrative was simply about home decor preferences, as if the gradual erasure of his memory was a reasonable evolution rather than a calculated rewriting of our family history. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, crowded with serving dishes and the elaborate meal Patricia had spent days preparing. But what dominated the space was the tension. Years of accumulated resentment and unspoken truths that had been carefully managed but never addressed. "It wasn't just furniture, Mom. It was one of the few things we had left that actually belonged to him." "Your father has been gone for 24 years, Natalie. It's time to move forward." Move forward. The phrase Patricia used whenever my father's memory threatened to complicate the narrative she'd constructed about our family's evolution. A narrative where George's arrival had completed our family rather than replacing what we'd lost. Where our improved financial circumstances had healed all wounds rather than creating new ones. Where my resistance to full integration into the Thornfield identity represented stubborn nostalgia rather than legitimate grief. Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of family celebration that I never quite felt part of, I realized that my father's chair was just the latest casualty in a campaign that had been going on for years. The photos that had gradually disappeared from prominent places, the traditions that had been modified to better suit George's preferences. The stories about my father that had been discouraged as dwelling on the past, while new family mythology was constructed around George's leadership and Patricia's social aspirations. But it was the next moment that changed everything. As I stood there processing the loss of my father's chair, Uncle Robert's booming voice carried clearly from the dining room. "Patricia's done such an incredible job creating a real family unit here. You'd never know Natalie wasn't actually George's daughter." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Not George's daughter? As if my 17 years with George had been an elaborate performance rather than a genuine relationship. as if my biological connection to this family was somehow less authentic than the legal papers that had made me my stepfather. And then came my mother's response, carrying clearly through the open kitchen doorway for everyone to hear. Well, blood doesn't always make family. Real family is about shared values and commitment to each other. The implication was unmistakable. In Patricia's carefully constructed worldview, I had failed to demonstrate the shared values and commitment that would qualify me for true family membership. My artistic career instead of a traditional path, my questioning of family decisions instead of grateful acceptance, my loyalty to my father's memory instead of complete integration into the Thornfield identity. But it was what happened next that would change everything forever. If you're loving what you're hearing, smash that subscribe button. It really keeps us going. All right, let's jump back in. To understand how Christmas Eve 2023 became the night that shattered the Thornfield facade, you need to know how 17 years of careful conditioning had trained me to accept my role as the perpetual outsider in my own family. It started innocently enough when George Thornfield married my mother in 1995. I was 12, still grieving my father's death and desperately wanting the stability that George seemed to offer. He was everything my artist father hadn't been: financially successful, socially connected, practical. Where my father had encouraged my sketching and supported my creative projects, George believed in channeling artistic energy toward marketable skills. Natalie has such potential, he would tell my mother during those early years, but she needs guidance toward more realistic career paths. Art is a wonderful hobby, but it's not a foundation for adult security. My mother, struggling to rebuild our lives after my father's unexpected death, embraced George's perspective with the desperation of someone who'd learned that creative passions didn't pay medical bills or provide college funds. The gentle encouragement of my artistic pursuits gradually transformed into concerned redirection toward more practical interests.
The shift was so gradual, I barely noticed it happening. My art supplies were moved from the dining room table to the basement. My drawings were relocated from refrigerator display to desk drawer storage. Family conversations about future plans increasingly excluded my creative ambitions in favor of discussions about sensible career options that would provide stability. Meanwhile, Daniel and Cassandra were thriving under George's influence. Daniel, who had always been academically gifted, found a mentor in George's business-focused approach to life. Cassandra discovered that her natural salesmanship aligned perfectly with George's ideas about professional success. Both quickly adapted to the Thornfield family values: financial achievement, social respectability, and practical decision-making, above all else. I, on the other hand, remained stubbornly attached to my father's memory and the creative path he had nurtured. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was a fundamental incompatibility with the family identity George was constructing. Where Daniel and Cassandra saw opportunity for growth and advancement, I experienced pressure to abandon the core of who I was. The family dynamics crystallized around our different responses to George's leadership. Daniel became the heir apparent to George's business legacy, eventually joining Thornfield and Associates straight out of college. Cassandra leveraged George's professional connections to launch her pharmaceutical sales career. Both were held up as examples of how the Thornfield approach to life planning created success. My choice to pursue graphic design after college was met with barely concealed disappointment, despite the fact that my business had become increasingly profitable over the past 8 years. Success, in the Thornfield worldview, was measured by traditional metrics: steady corporate employment, suburban home ownership, conventional family structures. My downtown loft studio, freelance client base, and unmarried status at 31 represented everything they considered professionally and personally unstable. The Christmas celebrations over the years had become increasingly elaborate productions, showcasing Thornfield family achievement. George's business success allowed for catered meals, expensive gift exchanges,
and holiday decorations that rivaled department store displays. But beneath the surface glamour, these gatherings served as annual performance reviews where family members' life choices were evaluated against Thornfield's standards. Daniel's promotion to partner was celebrated with champagne toasts. Cassandra's sales awards were displayed prominently on the mantelpiece. My design awards, when mentioned at all, were described as nice recognition for her little business, before conversation quickly moved on to more substantial accomplishments. The subtle marginalization became more pronounced after Cassandra's twins were born 4 years ago. Suddenly, family conversations revolved around the next generation and how to ensure the girls grew up with proper values and expectations. I watched my role evolve from disappointing daughter to cautionary tale, an example of what happened when artistic impulses weren't properly channeled toward practical outcomes. It's important for the girls to see different life paths, Patricia would say when explaining my presence at family gatherings, so they can make informed decisions about their own futures. Translation: Aunt Natalie's unconventional lifestyle served as a warning about the consequences of prioritizing creativity over security, independence over family integration, artistic fulfillment over financial optimization. The past 2 years had brought an acceleration of this marginalization. George's recent promotion to senior partner had elevated the family's social standing in Cedar Falls, bringing invitations to exclusive country club events and charity board positions that Patricia embraced enthusiastically. My presence at these elevated social functions became increasingly problematic, not because I couldn't induct myself appropriately, but because my career and lifestyle didn't align with the image they were cultivating. "Perhaps it would be better if you skipped the Whitmore Foundation Gala last spring," Patricia had suggested last spring. "The conversation tends to focus on business development and investment strategies that might not be relevant to your situation." These exclusions were always presented as considerations for my comfort rather than acknowledgments of my perceived inadequacy. I was being protected from boredom, spared from irrelevant discussions, saved from social situations where I might feel out of place. The underlying message was clear: I no longer fit the family's elevated circumstances. But it was the incident with my father's photographs that revealed the true extent of the revisionist history being implemented. 3 months ago, during a casual visit, I'd noticed that the family photo gallery in the front hallway had been completely reorganized. The pictures chronicling our family's evolution now began with George and Patricia's wedding, as if our life story had started in 1995 rather than continuing from earlier chapters. "Where are the photos from before you married George?" I asked my mother, standing in front of what had once been a comprehensive display of our family history. "Those old pictures were looking dated," she had replied without making eye contact. "The new arrangement has better visual flow and represents our family as it is now, not as it was decades ago." The photos of my father, holding me as a baby, teaching Daniel to ride a bike, helping 7-year-old me build a snowman, had been relegated to a small album tucked away in the guest bedroom closet. Not destroyed, but effectively erased from the family narrative displayed to visitors and grandchildren. "But the girls should know about their grandfather," I had protested, thinking of Cassandra's twins who had never heard stories about the man whose artistic encouragement had shaped my entire worldview. "George is their grandfather," Patricia had corrected firmly. "Children shouldn't be confused with complicated family histories when they have a loving, present grandfather to focus on." That conversation had been my first clear recognition that my father's memory wasn't just being downplayed, it was being systematically eliminated. Every trace of our pre-George existence was being minimized or removed to create a cleaner narrative about the Thornfield family's origins and values. The past 6 months had brought increasingly obvious signals that my role in family gatherings was becoming purely ceremonial.
Phone calls about holiday planning excluded me from decision-making while informing me of finalized arrangements. Gift exchanges were coordinated without my input, leaving me to guess at appropriate spending levels and present themes. Even basic information about family news reached me secondhand, often days after everyone else had been informed. By Thanksgiving, the dynamic had become unmistakable. I was included in family events as an obligation rather than a desire, a checkbox to be marked rather than a relationship to be nurtured. The conversations around me focused on shared experiences I hadn't been part of, inside jokes I didn't understand, and future plans that didn't include me. Walking into Christmas Eve dinner, I'd expected more of the same polite marginalization I'd grown accustomed to over the years. What I hadn't anticipated was how far the exclusion had actually progressed, or how the removal of my father's chair represented not just redecorating, but the final step in a long campaign to erase inconvenient aspects of family history. As I stood in that kitchen, processing Uncle Robert's casual comment about me not being actually George's daughter, and my mother's response about blood not making family, I realized I was witnessing the culmination of 17 years of gradual displacement. The family I'd tried so hard to remain connected to had already decided I didn't belong. But what happened next would prove they had seriously underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. The silence that followed my mother's declaration about blood not making family stretched for exactly 7 seconds. I know because I counted them, watching the second hand on the antique clock that had belonged to my father's grandmother tick past each moment of crystallizing realization. 7 seconds for 21 family members to process what Patricia had just said. 7 seconds for me to understand that this wasn't an offhand comment made in frustration, but a carefully considered statement about my fundamental status within the Thornfield family hierarchy. 7 seconds for the last illusion of belonging to finally shatter completely. When conversation resumed around the dining table, it carried a different quality, the forced lightness of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something significant. Daniel immediately launched into an animated story about his son's basketball team making regionals. Cassandra began helping her daughters arrange their napkins with exaggerated maternal attention. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and asked George about the new tax legislation affecting small businesses. But I remained frozen in the kitchen doorway, my mother's words echoing with perfect clarity. Blood doesn't always make family. Real family is about shared values and commitment to each other. The implication was surgical in its precision. After 31 years as Patricia's daughter, 17 years as George's stepdaughter, decades of trying to navigate the complex dynamics of a blended family while honoring my father's memory, I had been officially classified as someone who lacked the shared values and commitment necessary for true family membership. "Natalie," Patricia said quietly, returning to the kitchen with the controlled composure she had perfected over years of hosting social events, "help me carry these serving dishes to the table. Dinner is getting cold." The casual directive, as if nothing significant had just occurred, as if her public declaration of my non-family status was simply a conversational detour before returning to holiday meal logistics, triggered something I'd never experienced before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of Arctic clarity that felt both foreign and strangely liberating. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through my system, "I think we need to finish this conversation first." She paused in her arrangement of the glazed carrots, her expression shifting to the patient irritation she reserved for situations where I failed to read social cues appropriately. "There's nothing to discuss, Natalie. It's Christmas Eve. Everyone is waiting for dinner. Everyone is waiting to see if you're going to explain what you meant about blood not making family, and whether your daughter, your actual daughter, qualifies for membership in her own family." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. Patricia set down the serving spoon with deliberate precision, her movements carrying the controlled tension of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations through strategic de-escalation. "You're being overly sensitive about a casual comment. Uncle Robert was simply noting how well integrated our family has become since George joined us. My response was agreeing that family bonds are built through shared experiences and values, not just biological connections." There it was again, the masterful reframing that had characterized our relationship for years. My hurt wasn't valid because her comment had been casual. My interpretation was incorrect because she'd really been praising family integration. My emotional response was inappropriate because I was being overly sensitive to innocent observations. But this time, the familiar pattern felt different. Instead of second-guessing my own perceptions, I found myself analyzing her response with the same critical eye I used when reviewing client contracts for hidden clauses and unfavorable terms. "Integrated," I repeated slowly. "That's an interesting word choice. It suggests that I somehow failed to integrate properly into this family, despite living here for 5 years after you married George, despite taking his name, despite spending 17 years trying to earn acceptance from people who apparently view me as a perpetual outsider."
Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that my response had deviated from her expected script. Usually, by this point in our conflicts, I would have apologized for misunderstanding, thanked her for clarifying her intentions, and moved on to helping serve dinner while privately questioning whether my hurt feelings were justified. "You chose to move out at 17 for college and never really came back," she said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when explaining why my perspectives were fundamentally flawed. "You chose to build a life in the city rather than maintaining close family connections. You chose career paths that kept you separate from family business and social circles. Integration requires mutual effort, Natalie." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its completeness. My departure for college, encouraged by both Patricia and George as the natural progression for an academically successful teenager, was reframed as abandonment. My building an independent adult life, rather than remaining financially and emotionally dependent, was characterized as choosing separation. My successful graphic design career was portrayed as self-imposed isolation rather than professional achievement. Most remarkably, the years of gradual exclusion from family planning, the systematic removal of my father's memory from family spaces, the increasingly obvious preference for Daniel and Cassandra's conventional life choices, none of this appeared in Patricia's narrative about mutual effort in family integration. "Mutual effort," I said, feeling that strange clarity expanding. "Like when you removed all of Dad's photos from the hallway without mentioning it to me? Like when you donated his chair without asking if I might want it? Like when you stopped including me in holiday planning discussions or family decision-making? Your father died 24 years ago, Natalie. Healthy families don't build shrines to the past. We've created a loving, stable environment focused on the present and future, not dwelling on tragedy." There was the core of it finally stated explicitly. My father wasn't just absent from current family narratives. His memory was actively problematic, something to be minimized and eventually eliminated in service of Patricia's preferred version of family history. My loyalty to his memory wasn't touching or understandable. It was unhealthy dwelling that prevented proper integration into the Thornfield family identity. The kitchen had grown quiet, except for the distant sounds of dinner conversation from the dining room. But beneath that surface normalcy, I could sense the attention of 21 family members who were undoubtedly aware that something significant was developing in the kitchen, even if they couldn't hear our specific words. "You know what, Mom?" I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "You're absolutely right. Family is about shared values and commitment to each other."
Patricia's expression relaxed slightly, apparently interpreting my agreement as capitulation and preparation for the ritual apology that usually concluded our difficult conversations. "I'm glad you understand. Which is why I need to ask you something directly. What exactly are the shared values I've failed to demonstrate? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the main family value is erasing inconvenient history and replacing authentic relationships with performed loyalty." The change in Patricia's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The patient, explanatory tone vanished, replaced by the steel I'd glimpsed occasionally over the years, but never experienced this directly. "You will not stand in my kitchen on Christmas Eve and lecture me about family values. You will not disrupt this dinner with your constant need to relitigate ancient history, and you will not use your father's memory as a weapon against the family that welcomed you with open arms." Welcomed with open arms, as if my presence in this house had been an act of charity rather than the natural right of a daughter. As if the gradual marginalization, the systematic removal of my father's memory from family spaces, the increasingly obvious preference for Daniel and Cassandra's conventional life choices, had been generous accommodations rather than calculated diminishment. But it was her next words that crossed a line I hadn't even realized existed. "Frankly, Natalie, your father would be ashamed of the bitter, ungrateful woman you've become. He raised you to be better than this petty resentment and attention-seeking behavior." The invocation of my father, the man she'd spent years erasing from family memory as a character witness against me, was so breathtakingly manipulative that for a moment I could only stare at her in amazement. She was simultaneously arguing that dwelling on his memory was unhealthy while using his imagined disapproval to shame me into compliance. It was in that moment of crystalline understanding that I realized Patricia had made a fatal tactical error. For 17 years, she'd maintained her authority through careful modulation, never pushing quite hard enough to force a definitive confrontation, always leaving room for me to interpret her actions as well-intentioned rather than deliberately hurtful. But by invoking my father's memory as a weapon while simultaneously working to erase it, she had revealed the true scope of her revisionist project. This wasn't about healthy family evolution or natural changes in dynamics. This was about total control of family narrative, complete elimination of competing influences, and absolute authority over how our history would be remembered and our future would be shaped.
Standing there in the kitchen, where I'd helped prepare countless family meals, where I'd done homework at the counter while my mother cooked dinner, where some of my last conversations with my father had taken place before his fatal accident, I felt something shift fundamentally in my understanding of my situation. This wasn't about being a better daughter or trying harder to integrate or finding ways to honor both my father's memory and my stepfather's role. This was about recognizing that some people view relationships as zero-sum competitions, where love, loyalty, and memory must be carefully rationed and controlled. Patricia had spent years positioning herself as the reasonable party, trying to help me navigate complex family dynamics. But her mask had finally slipped completely, revealing someone who viewed my continued existence as an obstacle to her preferred family narrative. Someone who needed my compliance or my absence, but definitely not my authentic presence. The realization was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For years, I'd been trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution because the game itself was rigged. Patricia didn't want better communication or deeper understanding or compromised solutions. She wanted total victory in a competition I hadn't even realized we were playing. From the dining room, George's voice carried into the kitchen. "Patricia, is everything all right? Dinner's getting quite cold." My mother straightened her shoulders, preparing to return to her role as gracious hostess, managing a minor kitchen delay. "Coming, dear. Natalie was just helping me with the final preparations."
She moved toward the serving dishes, clearly expecting me to fall back into my assigned role as kitchen helper, dinner server, and marginalized family member grateful for inclusion in holiday celebrations that honored everyone except the people who'd shaped my early life. But I didn't move toward the serving dishes. Instead, I remained exactly where I was, blocking her path to the dining room, and said the words that would change everything. Actually, Mom, I think it's time everyone heard exactly what you really think about family values and shared commitment, because what you just said about Dad, that needs to be shared with the whole family. The look of absolute panic that crossed Patricia's face told me everything I needed to know about how carefully she'd cultivated different versions of herself for different audiences. Her kitchen conversation persona, dismissive, controlling, revisionist, was never meant to be witnessed by the dining room full of family members who saw her as the gracious matriarch who'd successfully blended a complex family. But that separation was about to end permanently. Walking back into that dining room felt like entering a theater where I was about to perform in a play nobody else knew had started. 21 faces turned toward me with varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and carefully maintained Christmas dinner politeness. They'd heard raised voices from the kitchen, but were following the unspoken family rule about pretending uncomfortable moments hadn't occurred. Patricia Thornfield, the gracious hostess and devoted mother, had just been revealed as someone who would invoke a deceased husband's memory to shame his daughter. "That's not," Patricia began, but I held up my hand. "Please, let me finish, because I want everyone to understand exactly what shared values and commitment look like in this family." I turned to address the table directly, making eye contact with different family members as I spoke. 3 months ago, Mom removed all the photographs of my father from the family gallery without telling me. When I asked where they were, she said they looked dated and didn't represent the family as it is now. Today, I discovered that she donated his Windsor chair, the one he saved 3 months to buy, the one that was his favorite piece of furniture in this house, to charity without mentioning it to anyone. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Natalie, maybe this isn't the best time."
When would be the best time, Daniel? I interrupted, feeling a surge of clarity about how family conversations had been managed over the years. When would be appropriate to discuss the systematic erasure of our father's memory from this house? During your birthday dinner? At Cassandra's anniversary party? Or should I schedule a separate meeting that everyone can skip because it's too uncomfortable to address directly? George set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "Natalie, I understand you're upset, but these decisions about household arrangements aren't attacks on your father's memory. Sometimes changes are simply practical." "Practical?" I repeated, turning to face my stepfather directly. "Is that what you call it when a family systematically removes all traces of a deceased parent's existence? When his chair is donated, his photos are hidden, and his daughter is told she doesn't share the family's values because she remembers him fondly?" The room had grown completely still. Cassandra's daughters, 11-year-old twins who'd been quietly eating their dinner, were watching with the wide-eyed attention children give to adult conflicts they don't fully understand, but recognize as significant. "Girls," Cassandra said quietly, "why don't you go play in the living room for a few minutes?" "Actually," I said, surprising myself with the decision, "I think they should hear this. Because they're going to grow up in this family, and they should understand how memory and loyalty are managed here." I looked at my nieces, these bright children who'd never heard stories about their grandfather, who didn't know that the artistic creativity they'd inherited came from him, who had no idea that their family history extended beyond the Thornfield narrative they'd been raised with. "Your grandfather, my dad, was an artist. He painted watercolors of the lake where we used to go camping. He taught me how to draw perspective and color theory. He built the treehouse in the backyard that you plan sometimes. He loved Christmas morning pancakes and always let us open one present on Christmas Eve." "Natalie, that's enough," Patricia said sharply, her composure finally cracking completely. "You will not use my grandchildren to wage some campaign about ancient history." "Ancient history?" I stood up straighter, feeling the full weight of my decision settling around me. "Is that what you call their grandfather? The man who was my father for 7 years before he died?
The man whose creativity and encouragement shaped everything I became professionally. Uncle Robert, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation, attempted to restore order. Perhaps we should all take a breath and remember this is Christmas Eve. Family disagreements can be resolved privately without ruining the holiday. This isn't a family disagreement, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. This is me finally understanding that I've been gradually written out of this family story, and that my father's memory has been systematically erased to make room for a cleaner narrative about the Thornfield family origins. George's expression had shifted from concerned stepfather to the authoritative business leader he was at Thornfield and Associates. Natalie, you're clearly emotional and not thinking clearly. These accusations are unfair to your mother, who has done nothing but try to build a loving family environment. Loving family environment? I repeated slowly. Where one daughter's seating arrangement puts her practically in the kitchen? Where her career is consistently minimized as a little business, while her siblings' conventional jobs are celebrated? Where her questions about family decisions are treated as disruptions rather than legitimate concerns? I gestured toward my isolated place setting. Really, look at it. I'm positioned where I can serve as kitchen help, where my conversations won't interfere with main table discussions, where I can be easily excluded from family photos. That's not accidental. That's deliberate marginalization disguised as table arrangement. Daniel had been quiet throughout my revelations, but now he spoke with the careful diplomacy he'd learned in business school. Alex, you're reading intent into decisions that were probably just practical. Mom's been planning this dinner for weeks, managing complicated logistics. Alex, I interrupted, genuinely startled. My name is Natalie. Natalie Marie Hartwell. Not Alex, not Nat, not whatever abbreviated version feels more convenient. And the fact that you just called me by the wrong name pretty much proves my point about how invisible I've become in this family. The error had been revealing in ways Daniel clearly hadn't intended. After 31 years as his sister, he'd unconsciously defaulted to calling me by a name that wasn't mine, a small but perfect illustration of how thoroughly my actual identity had been overlooked in favor of whatever version felt most manageable. Cassandra looked stricken. We didn't realize. We weren't trying to exclude you. If you felt left out, why didn't you say something sooner? I did say something, I replied, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and liberation as the truth finally came out. I asked about holiday planning and was told arrangements were already finalized. I questioned seating choices and was told they were for better conversation flow. I expressed concern about Dad's photos being removed and was told I was being overly sentimental about the past. I paused, looking around the table at faces that seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Every time I tried to address these issues, I was told I was misunderstanding good intentions, being too sensitive, or failing to appreciate the family we'd built together. After a while, you stop bringing up problems when the consistent response is that the problem is your perception, not the actual situation.
Patricia had been growing increasingly agitated during my explanations, and now she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is absolutely enough. I will not sit in my own dining room on Christmas Eve and listen to this character assassination. You are deliberately misrepresenting normal family decisions as some conspiracy against you. Then help me understand, I said, meeting her gaze directly. Explain how removing Dad's photos supports family unity. Explain how donating his chair without mentioning it shows respect for his memory. Explain how telling me he'd be ashamed of who I've become demonstrates maternal love. The challenge hung in the air between us. For years, Patricia had managed difficult conversations by reframing my concerns as misunderstandings and redirecting focus toward my emotional responses rather than addressing the substance of my complaints. But this time, I'd presented specific actions that were difficult to reinterpret as anything other than deliberate erasure. Your father, Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled anger, died 24 years ago. I have spent 2 decades building a stable, loving family environment for you and your siblings.
I married a wonderful man who welcomed you as his own daughter, provided for your education, and treated you with nothing but kindness. And your response has been to maintain this shrine to the past that prevents you from fully embracing the family we created together. There it was, the core belief that had driven years of gradual erasure. In Patricia's worldview, honoring my father's memory was inherently disloyal to George and the family they'd built together. My refusal to let his presence fade completely was evidence of ingratitude rather than natural grief and love. But here's what you never understood, Mom, I said, feeling the last pieces of my decision falling into place. I never needed to choose between loving Dad's memory and appreciating George's role in our family. You created that competition. You made it impossible to honor both relationships because you needed total loyalty to your preferred version of family history. George, who had been listening with increasing discomfort, finally spoke directly. Natalie, I never asked you to forget your father. I've always respected his place in your life. With respect, George, that's not entirely true. You've been quietly supportive of every decision to minimize his presence in this house. You never protested when his photos were removed or his chair was donated. You've participated in creating a family environment where my loyalty to his memory marks me as someone who hasn't properly integrated into the Thornfield family identity. The accusation was gentler than what I'd directed toward Patricia, but it was equally clear. George's passive participation in the erasure was still participation, regardless of his personal intentions. And now, I continued, turning back to address the entire table, I'm being told that my failure to embrace this erasure means I don't share the family's values of commitment and mutual support, that blood doesn't make family, and I apparently haven't earned my place through proper demonstration of Thornfield values. The dining room had grown cold despite the central heating, and the elaborate Christmas feast sat largely untouched as 21 people grappled with revelations that recontextualized years of family dynamics they'd witnessed but never questioned. So let me be absolutely clear about something, I said, feeling a strange sense of peace settling over me as I prepared to deliver the response that had been building for 17 years. You're right that family is about shared values and commitment to each other. But your values include erasing inconvenient history, minimizing family members who don't conform to preferred narratives, and demanding gratitude for inclusion in a family where I was already a daughter and sister before you decided to redefine membership requirements. I looked directly at Patricia, seeing her fully clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. So when you say, I'm not family, you're absolutely correct. I'm not Thornfield family. I'm Hartwell family, and I'm done pretending those are the same thing. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room, heavy with the weight of truths that couldn't be taken back or reframed as misunderstandings. I had finally said what both Patricia and I knew for years, but never acknowledged directly. Our definitions of family were fundamentally incompatible, and I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. But there was one more thing that needed to be said, the response that would make this moment unforgettable for everyone present. Patricia's face had gone completely white, her carefully maintained composure shattered by my public declaration that I was no longer willing to pretend we shared the same understanding of family loyalty. For 17 years, she had operated on the assumption that my desire to belong would ultimately override any objections to how that belonging was defined and maintained. She was wrong. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for moments when carefully constructed authority faces direct challenge. "How dare you stand in my home and reject the family that raised you, educated you, and supported you through every phase of your life?" The dining room remained frozen in absolute silence, 21 people watching a confrontation that was rewriting decades of family mythology in real time. But I felt strangely calm, centered in a way I hadn't experienced since my father's death 24 years earlier. "You're right that this family supported me. Daniel and Cassandra have been wonderful siblings. George provided stability and financial security when we desperately needed both. Many of you around this table have shown me genuine love and acceptance over the years.
I paused, looking at faces that were beginning to show recognition of the distinction I was drawing. But you, Mom, didn't support me. You managed me. You tried to reshape me into a version that fit your preferred family narrative. And when I couldn't completely abandon my father's memory or fully embrace values that required erasing part of who I am, you gradually excluded me while maintaining the appearance of inclusion. George cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation. Natalie, perhaps we could discuss this privately after dinner. Christmas Eve isn't the time for family therapy sessions. Actually, George, this is exactly the right time, I said, turning to address him directly. Because this is when the whole family is together. This is when we exchange gifts and share memories and celebrate the bonds that connect us. And it's important for everyone to understand that some of us have been excluded from those bonds for years while pretending everything was fine. I gestured toward the elaborate table settings, the expensive centerpieces, the carefully arranged seating that had marginalized me while celebrating everyone else. Look around this room. Look at how much effort went into creating the perfect Christmas celebration. Now ask yourselves, when was the last time anyone asked me about my life, my work, my hopes for the future? When was the last time my achievements were celebrated the way Daniel's promotions and Cassandra's sales awards have been recognized? The silence that followed was answer enough. Several family members shifted uncomfortably as they realized they couldn't recall recent conversations about my graphic design business, couldn't remember the last time my professional success had been acknowledged, couldn't identify when they'd last treated me as someone whose opinions and experiences mattered. That's what I thought. Because I've been gradually transformed from a family member into a family obligation, someone to be included out of duty rather than desire, tolerated rather than celebrated, managed rather than loved. Cassandra spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice small and uncertain. Natalie, we didn't realize. I always thought you preferred keeping some distance. You seemed happier living independently in the city. I did prefer independence, I acknowledged, but not because I wanted distance from family, because I learned that my authentic self wasn't welcome here. My career wasn't valued. My memories weren't appropriate. My questions weren't appreciated. Independence became survival. Uncle Robert, clearly desperate to restore some semblance of holiday normalcy, attempted intervention. Perhaps this is all just a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. Families have different communication styles, different ways of showing love. Uncle Robert, with respect, this isn't about communication styles. This is about whether someone can maintain their identity and still belong to a family, or whether belonging requires surrendering inconvenient aspects of who you are. I turned back to Patricia, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the conversation continued beyond her ability to control or redirect it. And that brings me to your question about how dare I reject this family, I said, feeling the weight of 31 years of accumulated hurt and frustration crystallizing into perfect clarity. I'm not rejecting the family, Mom. I'm rejecting your version of family that requires me to be grateful for conditional acceptance while pretending systematic exclusion is love. The moment had arrived. The response that would define this confrontation, that would establish new boundaries, that would make absolutely clear how fundamentally our relationship had changed. So here's my brutal reply to your declaration that I'm not family, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room. You're absolutely right. I'm not your family. Because real mothers don't spend 17 years systematically erasing their children's history to create cleaner narratives. Real mothers don't invoke deceased fathers as weapons against grieving daughters. And real mothers don't use Christmas dinner to publicly humiliate their children for failing to be sufficiently grateful for conditional love.
Patricia staggered backwards as if I had physically struck her, her hand gripping the edge of the serving table for support. "You are a curator, not a mother," I continued, feeling years of suppressed truth finally finding voice. "You curate family memories, selecting which parts of our history deserve preservation and which should be discarded. You curate family relationships, deciding who deserves celebration and who requires management. You curate family narratives, editing out complexities that don't serve your preferred version of events." The dining room had grown so quiet I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway, marking seconds in what felt like the longest moment of my life. "But you cannot curate love, and you cannot curate loyalty, and you cannot curate someone into being grateful for their own marginalization. What you can do is create the illusion of family while systematically destroying the authentic relationships that make families meaningful." I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope I'd been carrying for 3 months, ever since discovering the missing photographs. "Which is why I'm giving you this," I said, placing the envelope on the table in front of her. "It's a copy of every photo you removed from the family gallery, along with stories about Dad that your granddaughters have never heard, because they deserve to know their full history, not the edited version you've decided is appropriate." Cassandra's daughters had returned from the living room during my speech, drawn by the intensity of adult conversation they sensed was important, even if they didn't understand all the implications. Now they watched with wide eyes as their aunt offered them connection to a grandfather they'd been systematically prevented from knowing.
"And this," I continued, pulling out a second envelope, "is a letter I wrote to each of you explaining why I won't be attending future family gatherings where my presence is treated as an obligation rather than a joy, where my father's memory is considered problematic, and where my authentic self is seen as something to be managed rather than celebrated." The gasps around the table were audible now. The realization that this wasn't just a holiday argument that would be smoothed over with time and avoidance was sinking in for everyone present. "Natalie, please," Daniel said, his voice carrying genuine distress, "don't let one difficult conversation destroy our entire family relationship. We can work through this." "Daniel," I replied, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief, "this isn't one difficult conversation. This is the culmination of 17 years of gradually accepting less and less genuine connection in exchange for the appearance of family harmony. I'm not destroying our relationship. I'm finally acknowledging that it hasn't been authentic for years." I looked around the table one final time, making eye contact with family members who seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "I love many of you deeply," I said, "and my door is always open for anyone who wants to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. But I'm done pretending that performative inclusion is the same thing as love." George made one last attempt at family leadership. "Natalie, you're obviously upset and saying things you'll regret tomorrow. Why don't you take some time to cool down and we can discuss this rationally after the holidays?" I've never been more rational in my life. For the first time in 17 years, I'm seeing this family clearly, instead of through the lens of desperate belonging. And what I see is that some relationships require you to diminish yourself to maintain them, while others allow you to grow into your full potential. I gathered my coat and purse, moving toward the front door with steps that felt lighter than they had in years. "Thank you for the dinner invitation," I said formally, as if I were a guest rather than someone who'd grown up in this house. "And thank you for finally being honest about what family membership requires. It makes my decision much easier." Patricia found her voice one last time as I reached the doorway. "If you walk out that door, don't expect to be welcome back when you realize how much you're giving up." I paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back at the woman who had spent 17 years trying to reshape me into someone more convenient to love. "Mom," I said quietly, "I realized a long time ago how much I was giving up to stay. I just finally decided it wasn't worth it."
The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The December air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of snow and the distant sounds of other families celebrating Christmas Eve in ways that honored tradition and authentic connection. My phone buzzed immediately with text messages from family members, but I didn't check them. There would be time later for individual conversations with people who wanted to build genuine relationships. Tonight, I needed to drive home to my apartment in Millbrook, where my father's photos covered an entire wall, and his memory was celebrated rather than managed. 6 months later, I received a card from Cassandra's daughters, a drawing they'd made of the treehouse their grandfather had built, along with a note saying they'd found the stories about him in the envelope I'd left. Daniel had called twice, both conversations awkward, but sincere attempts to understand how the family dynamics had become so distorted without him noticing. George sent a brief email acknowledging that family integration shouldn't require erasing previous relationships, though he didn't apologize for his role in enabling the erasure. Uncle Robert and several cousins reached out individually, some to express support for my decision and others to share their own experiences of feeling marginalized within family systems that prioritized harmony over authenticity. Patricia never contacted me directly, though I heard through family networks that she'd told people I'd had some kind of breakdown that required distance and time to recover. Even in my absence, she was curating the narrative to protect her version of events. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after Christmas, I received a package with no return address. Inside was my father's Windsor chair, carefully restored and accompanied by a note written in elegant handwriting I didn't recognize. Miss Hartwell, I was the volunteer coordinator at Cedar Falls Community Services when your father's chair was donated. Your stepmother mentioned during drop-off that it had belonged to your deceased father, and something about his tone made me uncomfortable. I've been storing it in my garage, hoping the right opportunity would arise to return it. After reading about your family situation in the community newsletter, I realized that opportunity had come. Your father's memory deserves better protection than it was receiving. Margaret Chen, Community Services Volunteer.
Sitting in my father's chair for the first time in over a year, surrounded by his photographs and my own artwork, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment of clarity. The confrontation that had felt devastating in the moment had actually been profoundly liberating, freeing me from the exhausting project of trying to earn acceptance from people who viewed my authentic self as problematic. The family I'd thought I was losing had already been lost years earlier, replaced by a carefully managed performance where love was conditional on compliance and belonging required constant editing of identity. What I'd gained was something far more valuable: the recognition that genuine relationships don't require you to choose between honoring your past and embracing your present, between remembering who shaped you and appreciating who supports you now. As Christmas approached again, I was planning my first holiday celebration in my own space, designed around traditions that honored both my father's memory and my current life. Small, intimate, authentic. Everything the Thornfield Christmas productions had systematically eliminated in pursuit of impressive performance. The emerald green ornaments I'd chosen for my tree caught the afternoon light streaming through my studio windows, reminding me that some boundaries, once established, create space for possibilities you never knew existed. The brutal reply that had ended my family membership had actually begun my journey toward understanding what family could be when built on truth rather than convenience, love rather than management, authentic connection rather than curated perfection. And for the first time since my father's death, I was looking forward to Christmas morning. Next up, 2 more stories chosen just for you. If you enjoyed this, you'll want to see what's coming. Tap to keep going.